Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miri Ben Chaim. I'm the Director of the Division for External Studies of the Robert H. Smith Faculty of Agriculture, Food and Environment of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome to the first Pears webinar in plant sciences. This is our first adventure. This is a breakthrough of the Hebrew University, and this is a first webinar, and I wish you the best of luck and good morning. Professor Shuki Saranga, the head of this program.
Hello, good morning everybody. Again, I welcome you for the Pears webinar in plant sciences. And we shall start right away with our schedule. And our first speaker today will be a keynote speaker, Professor Shahal Abbo. Professor Shahal Abbo is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Faculty of Agriculture in Rehovot. He works on crop domestication, genetics, and physiology. And Shahal Abbo will give us a talk on plant domestication in the ancient Near East and its bearing on future plant breeding. Shahal, please. בבקשה. יש לך את זה, שחל? שחל, קדימה אחורה. קדימה אחורה.
Okay.
פוינטר.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation to speak a little bit on my work. And I hope that by the end of the talk I will be able to convince you that indeed the two parts of the title are related, ancient processes and future. And first of all, before I forget, I would like to acknowledge most of the ideas and data that came out of this work were a result of interaction with many people, and here you see just few of them, students and colleagues, including the head of your program. The lecture will be divided into two. The first part, in the first part, I will talk a little bit about certain aspects of plant domestication in the ancient Near East. This is a very big topic, and we can spend a whole course and, in fact, a lifetime discussing it. So I will just give you one aspect of that topic, and the second part I will focus on chickpea adaptation, a test case of how can we study from ancient how can we use studies of ancient processes and in order to improve future prospects for plant breeding. Now, in the ancient Near East, it is, if you read the literature, you will find tables of this kind. This is just an example. And people refer to a group of crop plants as the founder crops. These are the most ancient crops that were domesticated by ancient people in the Near East. And these include two species of wheat, diploid wheat, which is today only a relic crop. It is not of a very, it is not of any economic importance except some traditional farming systems in the Balkans and Turkey. Emmer wheat, which is tetraploid wheat, or durum wheat, which is a major crop today. Barley, lentil, pea, chickpea, bitter vetch, which is a forage crop, and flax, which was the first fiber crop of the Near Eastern agriculture. The map of the Near East, physical map, you see this mountain area that stretch along the eastern part of the Mediterranean to present-day Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And the geography actually creates a very distinct rain pattern. Most of the Near East, as you know, is desert. But that part, again, that mountain belt that I showed you earlier, is what we call, has a typical Mediterranean climate, which is basically 2 seasons. You know, 4 seasons is a piece of music by Vivaldi, but in the Near East we have only 2 seasons. A dry season, which is ending now, and a wet and cooler season, which will start sometime next month or sometimes even later. From December to February, we get 80% of our precipitation. And this stretch of area gets between 350, in some certain areas 800, and it creates what, again, in the literature is called the fertile crescent because of its shape. And in the center of that area, here, for instance, in eastern Turkey, this is how the landscape looks like. You get an oak pistachio woodland. Even 400 millimeters of rain can sustain perennial oak and pistachio trees and grasslands growing in between them. And this is the arena of the Near Eastern plant domestication. When we look in distribution maps of those species that I showed you in the table earlier, we see that einkorn wheat, tetraploid durum wheat, barley, lentil, pea, bitter vetch, and chickpea. Those areas on the map depict the natural distribution range of the wild progenitors, where we can find the wild plants that were those that were used by ancient people to domesticate the plants. Interestingly enough, if you put all the maps in superposition, one on top of each other, you will see that only in this area you can find them all. For instance, you cannot find wild chickpea here. You cannot find einkorn wheat here. Okay? So only in that region we find all of them occurring in natural habitats. One among many interesting questions is, are there any similarities in the processes of domestication of all these groups? Okay? Some people refer, or let's say the common knowledge, the prevailing paradigm that you will find in the literature is that, like here expressed by Dani Zohari, who is a world leading authority and composed several books on the topic, the domestication of lentil and pea, which are legumes, is not very different from that of wheat and barley. This is, as I said, the prevailing paradigm. And the rationale is that in both crop groups, both in the cereals and the legumes, part of the domestication process involved, for instance, loss of seed dormancy. The wild types have seed dormancy, while the domesticated plants do not. And similarly, wild plants have natural seed distribution mechanisms, like the spikes break down, shatter in the wild plants, and the pods of the legumes open, while in the domesticated plants this does not happen. We have indehiscent pods and non-brittle spikes. Now this approach stresses the role of automatic selection by ancient men, and we will soon see why. If you look at that part of the abstract by Zohari, he says that the changes from the wild-type seed dispersal and wild-type dormancy to the domesticated phenotype are best explained by assuming that mutations causing loss of wild-type adaptations, these are those traits, are automatically selected for soon after people transferred the wild plants, the wild progenitors, into a system of planting and reaping. Just by the fact that man is planting and then takes a sickle and cuts the plants perpetually, year after year after year, through many generations, this will give advantage to the domesticated phenotypes, and therefore they will be selected just by the action of man. Now this is a focus on phenotypes, on traits that minimize yield losses. This is understandable, but to me it reads like a typical Western productivity-oriented approach. Again, there is nothing wrong with it, but I will try to present an alternative which examines the differences rather than the similarities between these two crop groups, between the legumes and the cereals. And I think that by studying the differences, we can study more. Or again, build another brick in the building of, lay another brick in the building of knowledge. Now, the major biological differences that distinguish the legumes from their companion cereals are depicted in this table. In terms of population structure, in the wild, legume populations are patchy and thin, and cereal populations are massive and thick. And I will show examples. Plant stature. Most of those Near Eastern legumes are creeping plants not more than 30 centimeters tall. The legumes are tall plants, sometimes reaching stature of more than 1.5 meters. In terms of their growth habit, and I assume that most of you are agronomists, you should know that most of the legumes are indeterminate, while cereals have determinate growth habit. In terms of the dispersal units, legumes have camouflage seeds, while cereals have owned spikelets. And in terms of seed dormancy, again, legumes have 90% seed dormancy, while cereals have only 50% seed dormancy. I'm talking about wild plants all the time, remember. In terms of their floral biology, the legumes are cleistogamous. It means that the anthers shed the pollen while the flower is still closed before opening of the petals. And cereals have between 0.1 to 10% outcrossing in natural populations. So this is, again, a dramatic difference. Combining all these traits, because phenotypes are integrated in the living plants, gives us a result. The cereals are mostly aggressive plants, or at least those that were domesticated, compared with the legumes, which are poor competitors. So you see that by tabulating a very simple list of traits, we can see that these two groups are very, very different from each other. So there is at least a basis to start with looking at those differences. Treating each of those items in the table require more time than Shuki allowed me, so if you are interested, you can get this, look at this review. If any one of you do not have access, I'm happy to send it by email. And we will just check 3 of those. Population structure of cereals. In wild cereals populations, you can go today in Israel and Turkey and harvest something like 1 kilo of seeds. You can harvest spike material that will allow you to extract from the wild spikes about 1 kilo of seeds per hour of foraging, per hour of collection. This is a stand of wild barley. A student of Eyal took that photo. If you are going to look for wild chickpea or wild lentil, you will have to accustom to this posture, like this poor student over there. This is a wild chickpea plant. It is difficult to see the plant. This is a wild lentil plant. And for scale, you see my penknife. So the plant is no longer than that. And if you calculate what you can extract from wild populations at the time when the pods are beginning to mature, we did it. You see that the potential yield is mostly less than 10 grams per hour. So we are not talking about kilos per hour, we are talking about meager few grams per hour. So this tells you that you cannot treat wild lentil and wild wheat similarly, because the potential of the plant is different, and we can again fairly we can assume that also ancient people were unable to treat them similarly. Now, as we said, not only populations are small and patchy in legumes, the legumes also have indeterminate growth habit. This is a big wild lentil plant. You can see that while in the upper internodes there are still flowers and immature pods, at the lower internodes there are pods that have already shattered their seeds. So at any one time when you visit a wild lentil or a wild chickpea population, you can only harvest a certain and rather small fraction of the total yield, okay, because of this indeterminate growth habit. If you compare this to what you see in cereals, the development and maturation are rather synchronous, and it is again a different picture. So if we come to the last point, the strong competitiveness of the cereals compared with the poor competitiveness of the legumes imply that sowing and tending of legume fields was imperative for securing reasonable yield, while this was not quite necessarily with the cereals. And again, this may have inspired the ancient development of agro techniques for legumes, which was not necessary for cereals. An interim conclusion: in historical perspective, the different biological features of the legumes and the cereals require different treatments by the ancient farmers, and as a result, each crop group and even each crop in its own right had a different evolutionary trajectory under domestications, once people have decided to domesticate. This is evident from the present pattern of barley and wheat cropping systems. Wheat and barley and pea, for example, cover much larger area compared, for instance, with chickpea or lentil in present-day modern system. And now we go to the chickpea test case, and here, maybe in a delay, maybe I should have stated it earlier, but this is the rationale of the whole talk, of the whole approach of my work on this topic. The potential of every crop plant is by definition a function of its evolutionary history. Therefore, if we take such an approach, it may help us to understand the genetic basis of the yield limiting factors of the crop. And if we understand the yield limiting factors, this may open us new avenues, new ways to assist breeders in improving crop plants. If we look at this table again, and we should all remember that all those plants in the wild are cool season annuals. Cool season annuals in the Near East means that they germinate after the first autumn rains. In this area, it is sometime in October and November. And by the late spring, they mature and disperse their seeds and dry off. Similarly, the domesticated plants that were domesticated from these wild progenitors are all cool season annuals. Wheat is either a winter crop or an autumn sown crop. However, chickpea is a traditional spring crop in the Mediterranean region, which is entirely different from all the rest. How does it look like? If you travel in eastern Turkey in June, you will see that all the wild annuals in that oak pistachio woodland belt, they are all dry. You can see them here. However, a chickpea field is still green at that time of the year. This is no surprise because it is planted in the spring. So despite its origin as a cool season annual, in most of the traditional growing areas, chickpea is a post-rainy crop. It's a post-monsoon crop in India, in the Indian subcontinent, and a spring crop in the Mediterranean basin. Here, for instance, Aleppo in Syria, this is the rainfall pattern from September to May, and this is the temperature pattern, and traditional planting will be in March or even in April, at the end of the rainy season. Similarly, in India, planting is, for example, in Kanpur, in October, during the cooler time of the year, and after the end of the monsoon. Okay? So the crop, chickpea crop, grows on what we call residual soil moisture. But crops which rely on residual soil moisture have a limited potential yield. Why did ancient Near Eastern farmers give up the opportunity to grow chickpea during the rainy season like they do for wheat and barley? The reason is very simple: a disease with the name of Ascochyta blight, which devastates the crop, and in the absence of chemical pesticides, this is the only way to avoid the disease, is to plant the crop after the rainy season. The life cycle of the pathogen includes both a sexual stage and an asexual stage, and in both cycles the formation of the spores, the ascospores or the pycnidiospores, is dependent on repeated rainstorms. So if you plant your chickpea crop after the rainy season, there is hardly any risk of blight, and this was an ancient way to avoid the risk of the disease. Low yield but stable, low yield but secured. So the pathogen spreads via rain splash, and as I said, the only way to avoid it is to plant it after the rainy season. But germination under domestication in March and April resulted in a unique adaptation profile. This unique adaptation profile as a spring crop allowed the adoption of chickpea from the Near East to the Indian subcontinent as a post-monsoon crop. Is it simple to convert a cool season annual into a spring sown annual? What did it take? Again, if we resort to this list, you will note, maybe you are aware of the fact that wheat and barley and also pea are known to have vernalization requirements, or at least in pea and barley there are winter types and spring types. Okay, this is the ancestral situation. Wild wheat, wild barley have vernalization requirements. What is vernalization? Just a short definition. It is a growth period under suboptimal temperatures which accelerates flowering, and this is a major adaptation for temperate plants to avoid frost damage, for precocious early flowering at the end of the winter or in the early spring. So it delays flowering to the right season. Now, is it possible at all to satisfy the vernalization requirement for a plant which is planted in the spring? The vernalization requirement for winter wheat and winter barley are satisfied because they are planted early in the season and stay under the snow or grow in a cool season during the winter. So it is no surprise that we find titles like this in the literature. That vernalization in chickpea, you know, if somebody who writes a paper asks such a question, it means that the conclusion, you can know that the conclusion before reading the article, you can guess that the conclusion is that the vernalization is an artifact. Okay? And indeed, when tested, domesticated chickpea do not show vernalization response. But we have to assume that the ancient farmers had to get rid of the wild chickpea vernalization requirement in order to convert it into a spring sown plant. And when you go to eastern Turkey in the right time, in November, you will see that the wild plant has already germinated, so it will be there exposed to snowstorms and low winter temperature. And here, this is a mistake. This is a vernalized plant, and this is a control plant. You see that the vernalized plant look entirely different. And when you look at the domesticated chickpea, you can not see any effect. When we look at flowering data, we see that by vernalization, we can advance flowering time of wild chickpea by more than 20 days with hardly any effect in domesticated chickpea. And we can also see this in F2 progeny derived from a cross between two such lines. So the history of chickpea as a crop involved two contrasting selection cycles. In the ancient times, it was converted from a winter annual to a spring crop. And in modern times, we are trying to convert it from a spring crop to a winter crop in order to maximize its potential. And when you undergo such contrasting selection cycles, you lose traits because of genetic erosion. And these traits include and are not limited to Ascochyta blight resistance, vernalization response, and cold hardiness. Domesticated chickpea is very poor in terms of its cold hardiness. And those lost traits correspond fairly good to what what people write in the literature as the major limiting factors for chickpea production. So again, you see that the yield limiting factors are in fact they mirror, very simply, they mirror the evolutionary history of the plant. Now in the recent decades, chickpea is emerging as an important rotation crop in temperate growing regions in the United States and also in Canada, in the Great Plains. But in that area where they can plant winter wheat, they cannot plant winter chickpea because it is killed by the severe winter. They plant chickpea only as a spring rotation, and again, its yield is very limited. But I hope that I managed to convince you that in the wild, in its nature form, wild chickpea is exposed to sub-zero temperatures. So if we resort to this gene pool of the wild chickpea, we have at least a hope to improve the cold adaptation, and maybe by reincorporating vernalization requirement into modern high-yielding domesticated chickpea, we can convert it into a winter crop. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shahal. Yes, you're just on time. And we have some time for discussion. We will take questions from the audience first, if there are any.
Can it be that the time that when mankind started domesticating cereals and then when it started domesticating legumes could make a difference in their different adaptation characteristics, or it doesn't matter?
I'm not sure I understand, but the both cereals and domesticated are thought to have been domesticated at the same time. There was no lag in time, like first they domesticated cereals and after 2,000 years or something like that they domesticated. Again, the common knowledge is that they were domesticated together because they complement each other both from agronomic point of view and also from nutritional point of view. So we cannot think, or for me it is hard to think about a community that lives on wheat alone, and after 800 years say, hey, why don't we domesticate a few legumes to have hummus with pita, you know? It doesn't work like that.
No, but maybe the other way. Let's say, since gathering legumes is very difficult, maybe they started growing legumes while the cereals were abundant out there in nature, so it was very easy to collect them?
It is possible. There is even, I mean, some people even mentioned it in the literature just once, that maybe legumes were the first crops. But most people that deal with plant domesticated, they concentrate on cereals, so they don't give attention to this idea, to this notion.
Is there an example for alleles coming from the wild that increase yield?
In chickpea?
No, in any crop.
I don't know. Well,
just a second. Dr. Eyal Friedman did not have the mic, so I will repeat his question. He asked if there are any examples that genes from the wild were used to enhance yield in any crop. Yes, Eyal?
Well, I'm not an expert for utilization of wild germplasm in plant breeding, but we all know an old paper by Tanksley about wild rice enhancing yield in nature, sometimes in the early 90s. What we are trying to do is not using wild alleles or wild traits to improve yield. We are trying to improve adaptation by improving its survival ability in colder environment. I'm not sure we are talking about increasing yield potential. We are talking about widening the area, widening adaptation. This is entirely different. So, but we didn't look into it, for instance, in chickpea. In my work, I didn't look into it. For example, we have no, for example, we have to support, we have no example for wild chickpea which has better resistance to diseases, for example. The domesticated one are superior. So.
Other questions from the audience? So I have a question. I mean, we have, Shahal and me have many hours of discussing these issues, but still, you know, there are still some questions that we are asking ourselves, and I would like to raise this question which came to my mind while he was talking. Shahal, the assumption about the area where agriculture began, the cradle of agriculture, is that all wild relatives of the how do you call them, of the ancient founder crops were located in a certain region, and therefore this region is the cradle of agriculture. Then my question is it necessarily that agriculture started in a region where all these wild species were available? Could it start in another region and then migrate to the other region? Could it start, let's say, with a part of these founder crops and then migrate to other regions and not necessarily in this particular area?
In principle, yes. In principle, you are right. But if you look, I did not have time, and as I said, I was just focusing on certain issues in this talk. If you look at this map, the numbers here are the numbers of the numbers here stand for archaeological sites from which archaeobotanists have excavated the most ancient dated forms, finds of domesticated cereals, for example. It is very difficult to distinguish domesticated chickpea from wild chickpea in archaeological material because all we have are the seeds. But in wheat and barley, we have the remains of the spikes. And if the spikes are not broken, it means that they are non-shattering, and it means, or the assumption is that they are domesticated. So our hypothesis that this is the cradle of agriculture does not rely only on the distribution maps. It relies on dated archaeological material, and it relies on many other archaeological considerations, like, for instance, many ancient technologies of using flint, arrowheads, and etc. start in this area and radiate. We have gradient of dated archaeological material. So this area was an area of innovation at some time in prehistory. But you are at least, I mean, you are right, at least in terms that most of the scientific community do not believe in our hypothesis, and they are fighting us. So you are in good company. Most people think otherwise. I'll give you simple argument. You know, some people say that here, because you have wild wheat and domesticated wheat, it was impossible to domesticate because the wild plants always were pollinating the domesticated crops. So there was introgression of the wild type alleles. So people could not have isolated, because of the introgression pressure, could not have isolated the domesticated forms. So what is the conclusion? If you take this argument in full scale, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that you could have domesticated only in Europe, west of the Balkan. So maybe plant domestication actually started in the Balkan or in Europe, and then the idea was transferred back to the Near East. But archaeology doesn't show this mark. So the Europeans find it very difficult to believe that plant domestication and actually ancient Western civilization started in the Near East. You see? It is very difficult for them because they do not estimate us to be worthy of such innovation. So anyway.
Other questions, please? Okay, if so, we shall thank Professor Shahal Abbo.